An 8-person bipartisan congressional delegation, including members of the House Armed Services Committee, recently returned from the Poland-Ukraine border for a first-hand look at conditions.
Congressman Gregory Meeks, the chair of the committee, visited to assess the needs at the border, which has received the largest influx of Ukraine refugees. The delegation also met with Ukrainian activists, national and local Polish officials, as well as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
For more, let's bring in Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. He was part of that delegation and also serves as the co-chair of the Ukraine and Ukrainian American Caucus. Congressman, welcome to the program. Thanks very much for being with us. You've talked publicly about the fact that what's happening in Ukraine is deeply personal to you. Explain why that's the case and tell us what you saw during your visit to the Poland-Ukraine border.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, I lived in Ukraine. My last international assignment as an FBI agent, which is what I did before I was in Congress, was in Ukraine. I worked side by side with the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, law enforcement, and the Rada, their parliament, to help them shore up their cybersecurity defenses and working counterintelligence operations against the Russians. And when I came to Congress, I became the co-chair of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. And my visit, we just got back yesterday. We were at the Ukraine-Poland border on Sunday, and that day we saw 102,000 refugees come across the border. Even more heartbreaking was on the Ukrainian side of the border, seeing the Ukrainian men, age 18 to 60, who had to go back and fight, drop off their spouses and their kids, perhaps seeing them for the last time.
Wow, 100,000 refugees in just one day, Congressman. That's extraordinary. You know, you tweeted out details of legislation you're now co-sponsoring to target Russia with even more sanctions. And you said, quote, our bipartisan bicameral legislation will send Putin and his cronies a clear message. The U.S. will secure our own energy independence, and we will not partake in Russia's energy manipulation tactics. So what would your legislation do that the White House has not done already?
Well, that legislation, it was introduced by myself and Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, was introduced last Thursday before we left for the Ukraine-Poland border. So it was welcome news today that the president is taking executive action on that front. However, we still need to proceed legislatively because we don't want this or any future administration to be able to backtrack on those sanctions. We believe that the United States ought not to spend one dime, not one penny, on Russian oil to basically fund Vladimir Putin's murder machine.
And Congressman, as you know, we've seen terrible images of civilians being targeted in Ukraine. How else can the U.S. send more military aid, particularly anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, to the Ukrainian military without further provoking Vladimir Putin?
This whole notion of Vladimir Putin being provoked, he's already said himself, he views financial sanctions as an act of war. So I think the trap that a lot of Americans are falling into is trying to apply our mindset to Vladimir Putin. This is not a sane man. I think what we need to do is show strength and resolve, along with our NATO allies, to make sure that we stand up for human rights, for freedom and democracy, whether it be Ukraine or anywhere else. And the Ukrainians need their help. The Ukrainian independence movement is 30 years old. They won their independence in 1991. Close to half of the Ukrainian population was born after 1991. They know little of and want no part of Kremlin rule, and we need to be there for them. So what Vladimir Putin was, for those of us that understand Putin, and I served in Ukraine, part of my job was to get inside his head every day to try to help the Ukrainians combat his propaganda. You got to understand, he smells weakness like a shark smells blood in the ocean. Weakness invites aggression. Strength actually will get him to back down.
So, Congressman, get inside his head for us and tell us what you think he would do if NATO were to impose a no-fly zone over the country, or even a limited no-fly zone over humanitarian escape routes, as some foreign policy experts are now proposing.
Yeah, well, there's two types of no-fly zones. First of all, there's a NATO military no-fly zone, and then there's a UN humanitarian no-fly zone. The International Red Cross, to my knowledge, the only NGO that's protected by the Geneva Convention, can't even get inside Ukraine to protect these innocent civilians because Vladimir Putin is dropping bombs on the civilian humanitarian pathways. That is unacceptable. So there are a number of ways you can enforce a no-fly zone. There seems to be a lot of conflation out there that somehow a no-fly zone is tantamount to kinetic strikes. That's not necessarily the case. Every single fighter jet has thousands of semiconductors. Every semiconductor emits what we call beacons or signals that can be jammed through EMP, electromagnetic pulse, cyber, sonar and radar capabilities to jam their comms and therefore ground aircraft. So there's a lot of education that I think needs to occur for people to make an accurate assessment on what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Because the bottom line, we have to protect these Ukrainian people. They are a young nation, they're 30 years old. We were a young nation at one point. They're struggling for their independence, and they need other freedom-loving democracies to have their back right now.
So over the weekend, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky pleaded with lawmakers on a conference call on Saturday for more help. What can you tell us about that, Congressman?
Yeah, I spoke directly to Vladimir Zelensky, and he told us exactly what he needs. Obviously, he needs assistance in the air. That was priority 1 through 5 for him. If he can't have a no-fly zone, what he's asking for is we provide him with the military assistance in the air. Javelins that we've been providing are anti-tank. Stingers are anti-helicopter. They can be doubling as an anti-aircraft for takeoff and landing, but they can't take out an aircraft in the sky. Only the S-300s that many of the neighboring countries have that are willing to give to him, by the way, Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovakia, and Romania have those devices they want to give them. The Polish have the MiGs. They said today they want to give them to Ukraine. And of course, the Turks have the drones that are so important. So everybody needs to play their role here. But if we're not going to send him direct military assistance in terms of troops, the least we can do is give him the equipment he needs to protect him and his people, and especially the humanitarian workers who are trying to get people out to safety.
Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, we thank you for your service to the U.S. in Ukraine, and thank you for coming to talk to us today. We appreciate it.
You bet.